Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. And yes, I am wearing a cap for the first time. I realize that with the change in my background, caps work better. In other words, there's not a ugly shadow caused on the background the way it was with the previous background. So I may switch over to caps gradually, or at least occasionally. I wanted to speak about the subject of what would be the aftermath of a nuclear war. Um, First, let me say that the reason why I am bringing this up is because people in my field, sociology, have long studied this issue. It has been a concern for sociologists since the nuclear weapons were first used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US at the end of World War II. It seems, well, it would seem comedic, except it's too serious to be comedic, that the US tries to prevent other nations, like Iran, for example, from getting a nuclear weapon, or is angry that North Korea has a nuclear weapon, when in fact, the only country to have ever used nuclear weapons was the US. The Enola Gay that flew over Japan, and till this day, there are people still alive who are living with the deformities that were caused by the dropping of those nuclear bombs on Japan. If there were to be a nuclear attack, nobody would be unaffected. And that is because of the nuclear fallout. Whether you are or are not in a nuclear target area, you would still receive the fallout to some extent. There are things that you can do, even if you are in a nuclear target area. There are places you can go. If you are in an apartment building, for example, there are places that are safer than others. But still, regardless, a nuclear war would be unimaginably devastating. And there would be no emergency services. Why? Well, I think it's obvious. The areas that would be affected, most affected, would be so dangerous that first responders would literally be unable to go there without risking their own lives. And so a nuclear war would really bring an end to much of human life and animal life on the planet. And it would mean tremendous changes for those people who managed to survive. So what I want to do in this podcast is to talk about the areas that are most likely and least likely to be affected by a nuclear war. And that is why I am wearing these glasses. I will take them off after I finish this reading exercise. I will place a link to this article below the podcast so you can read the entire article in context. This is a discussion here of the safest countries. And obviously you can extrapolate from that to which are the least safe countries. They are the ones that are not mentioned. So let me just read this one portion of the article to give you some idea of what will happen, and then we can talk about it afterwards. A study in August last year found that the countries with the best hope of at least seeing their civilization survive during the 10 years after a nuclear war would be Argentina and Australia. The reason they and several countries across Central Africa would be able to maintain life was because they already grew more resistant crops, such as wheat, in large quantities, and also had low populations. However, it wouldn't necessarily be peaches and cream for Australia, said Professor Alan Robach from Rutgers University in New Jersey, but because you can imagine that there will be flotillas of hungry refugees from Asia on their way there, meaning from Asia to Australia. So perhaps you could consider Iceland. The smart survivalist named the Nordic country, Iceland, as the safest place in the event of a nuclear war. Because Iceland is isolated from the rest of the world by the North Atlantic Ocean, it would be very difficult for a nuclear missile to reach Iceland without being detected first, it said. Also, it added, Iceland generates all of its electricity from geothermal sources. So even if the entire electrical grid went down, Iceland would still have power tanks to its natural springs. The site also noted that Canada has a large landmass and a population spread out over a wide area, making it less likely that a single nuclear strike could wipe out the entire country. Modeling by the Guardian newspaper in the UK back in 2016, found that should atomic annihilation be in the cards, one of the safest places to live would be Antarctica, because the sub-zero continent is miles away, or Easter Island in the South Pacific, which is more than 2,000 miles from South America. Well, a couple of those things don't really make much sense. First of all, Antarctica. The only people who live in Antarctica are scientists, because there are research stations set up there. There are no human communities or cities or towns or anything like that in Antarctica. It is not like the Arctic, where you have people who live. I mean, even parts of Finland, for example, reside in the Arctic, and there are thriving populations there. Not so in Antarctica. Nobody lives there. I mean, there are a lot of penguins. And interestingly, the penguins there are unafraid of humans because they know that they are not being attacked by humans, not being hunted by humans. Because from what I've read, penguins don't taste very good. But regardless, what we see here is a kind of mixed picture. Originally, I had hoped that it would be more cut and dry, that virtually all perhaps, of the countries that would survive would be countries in the third world. We take off my glasses now since I don't really need them anymore. But that's not the case. Australia is not a third world country. Iceland is also not a third world country. Despite its name, Iceland, people often confuse it with Greenland. Maybe the names should be switched. Iceland has a relatively moderate climate, not warm, but moderate. Greenland has a frigid climate. So in Greenland, where you see most people is right along the coasts. Because when you get into the interior, life becomes really, really difficult. That is not as true in Iceland. So Iceland is a modern country, a modern society, as is Australia, as is Canada, all of which are mentioned as possible areas of the world or safe zones in the event of a nuclear catastrophe. But also, Central Africa is mentioned, a part of the world that I have visited myself. And aside from anything else, like the types of crops that are grown, when I was there, what occurred to me is, why would this part of the world be a target for anyone? I don't think it would be. So it seems to me that Central Africa would be a relatively safe place. Also mentions Argentina as a relatively safe place. So again, where people would survive in the event of a nuclear holocaust is basically unknown. All we can do is take a look at the data and try to figure out, based upon energy sources used, types of habitats people live in, distance from places that would likely be the direct targets of a nuclear assault, we can likely predict to some extent where the most devastation would occur. But still, they are guesses. We really cannot know for sure. So, what that tells us, and I say this with sadness, is that it appears as though the first world and the third world are divided in terms of areas of survivability. That is not what I originally expected, as I said. I thought that the safe zones would lie almost entirely in the third world, but in fact, according to predictions, and I think those predictions come from very reliable sources, I've checked them out, are not that predictable, are somewhat haphazard. And so we really don't know the parts of the world that would most likely survive. Here, however, is a factor that was not addressed in the article, but one which has been addressed elsewhere. And so I will bring this into the discussion as well. In many parts of the third world, people are not as dependent on the power grid. People are not as dependent on industrialization as they are, by and large, throughout the entire first world. So even if the power grid went down in a certain area, even if electricity went down in a certain area, if you are living in a place which is not as dependent on the power grid and on electricity as most of the first world is, that would also likely increase your chances of surviving. So it's not a simple equation. You can't make these kinds of predictions with surefire accuracy. Again, everyone on the planet would to some extent suffer the consequences of any kinds of nuclear holocaust. Nuclear power is really, really dangerous, especially when it is weaponized. As a source of power, it may be okay if proper precautions are taken, if nuclear power stations are, for example, not placed in earthquake zones, which sometimes they are, which is hard for me to understand, but that is true. So again, the third world, I believe, offers our best hope for establishing socialism and communism. But the power grid and electricity and nukes are not the reasons for that, because much of the third world would be affected as much as the first world is. I mean, as I've said too many times, I'm just a couple of miles north of Mexico here. It's an arbitrary line. The Rio Grande River. Right here, the Rio Grande River is very, very narrow. You can walk from one side of the bridge to the other in about 4 minutes. That's how long it takes me. Now, I do walk relatively fast, but not that fast. I would imagine if I ran, if I weren't stopped by police or immigration or someone, I could probably get across much more quickly. It's not that far across. When you are in, for example, Nuevo Progreso in Mexico, you can see Texas. When you're in Texas, you can see Nuevo Progreso, Mexico. When you go down to the Rio Grande River closer to where I am and look across, there's Reynosa. It's right there. So the world is so interconnected. Like Marshall McLuhan said, the world is a village. And anything that affects one part of the world will invariably affect the rest of the world as well. So nothing can be guaranteed in the event of nuclear war. Here's the implication of what I just said. Although I do think, as I said before, that the third world offers us our best hope for survival in the event of a nuclear catastrophe. And the first world in general, especially the United States, is the most dangerous place to be. I mean, there are targets all over the United States. Most likely, almost the entire country, with perhaps some exceptions, would be destroyed. There would be nothing left of the US. But in Canada, there might be something left. So again, the issue is perplexing. It is hard for me anyway to wrap my head around it. It increases my pessimism, sadly. My pessimism might have been decreased had another scenario been predicted, namely that the countries that survived would be in the third world. The countries that did not survive would be in the first world. That would seem like a spectacular outcome to a truly devastating event. Because I think the third world has much more dialectical or revolutionary potential than the first world does. Now, are there parts of the first world which have dialectical or revolutionary potential? Yes, I think so. But by and large, the first world is devoid of it. There is no noticeable dialectical or revolutionary potential that I can see, for example, here in the US. And yet in places which have a much greater degree of dialectical potential, their chances of survival are often no different than ours. By ours, I mean the first worlds. So it is a conundrum. And it's one that I will continue wrestling with, I think, for a while. It's a subject I have not thought about in quite a while. It's not a comfortable topic to consider. Nobody wants to talk about a third world war. I don't know if one is around the corner. I don't think so. At least there's no immediate threat of that happening. But the chances are always there. The weapons are always there. The human actors who would launch those weapons are always there as well. So it is impossible to predict with any amount of certainty whether there will be a nuclear war on planet Earth, and if that war happens, which areas will be destroyed. So I realize this is well, at least from my perspective, a pessimistic video. Not because it is about nuclear destruction. That's a given. Of course, that is uncomfortable to contemplate. But again, because the areas with the greatest amount of dialectical potential or revolutionary potential may also be wiped out in a thermonuclear war. And if that happens, if there is literally nothing left behind, or almost nothing left behind of humans following such a harrowing event, then what will happen? Obviously, that is a question which cannot be answered because no one knows. But again, as I said, I realize that I'm repeating myself, but it's because I'm trying to work this thing out inside my head, maybe hoping each time I repeat it that I'll come up with an answer, which isn't happening. There's no guarantee of what will happen. And to me, that is the greatest tragedy of all. There is no guarantee of what will happen. And so we really cannot speak in terms of promise or in terms of probabilities. We don't know what those probabilities are. We don't know if we have any promise. And so that makes me sad, especially for the third world, because the third world is not the cause of most of these problems. These problems, for the most part, originate in the first world. And yet, because we are a single planet and we share one atmosphere, we share one Earth, the entire Earth could in fact be devastated. In that case, as a Maoist third worldist, I begin to feel pessimistic. I certainly hope that the third world remains. But what are the chances of that happening when places like Canada and Argentina are given a good chance of survival? And so is Antarctica, a place with virtually no life at all. I would encourage anybody who is watching this video to reflect on this subject as well. especially if you are a Maoist third worldist, but not only if you are one, but especially if you are one, because that means that that is something that you and I have in common. We share that. We share that. We share that belief in the greater dialectical potential in the third world. And yet, looking at that map, reading that description, makes me profoundly pessimistic and just hopeless almost. I guess hopeless is a good enough word for it. For the future of humanity. Let's hope things turn out in a more beneficial way, where the third world survives, at least in sufficient numbers, to bring about some genuine change in this world. For the time being, this is a rather saddened mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.